We descend the stone chairs, single file. The professor at the head, her torch casting a beam of light down into the dusty gloom. The second she drops below the layer of gold, the gentle waves of Heka that roll across her palm disappear. She stops for a moment and examines her hand, clenching and unclenching her fingers. She mutters something to herself, then looks over to us, raises her eyebrows, and carries on along her way. Sethos goes down after her. As the first one turned to stone, his top half and the contents of his backpack, including, it would seem, his digital camera, as the flash illuminates the wall of the narrow little corridor. The rest of us aren't so lucky. Everything in my own backpack has been soaked through along with my clothes, and I shiver despite the returning warmth that emanates from the walls. My torch has stopped working too, and I'm amazed that the professor's is still able to produce light. I go down third, and as a team, we follow the remaining wandering beams. The golden door above shuts fast behind us. The steps go around and around, down into the deep, and we walk in silence, processing the things we've seen, our experiences in the tomb, shooting the occasional glance up at the intricately carved eyes that watch suspiciously from amongst the rows of symbol and glyphs across the wall. The stairs come to an end at an archway, one that leads into the third layer, a wide and open space shrouded in darkness. A small pot of oil sits at the base of each of the archway's pillar, and the professor reaches up for the wooden torch attached to the wall, unfastening it from its perch and dipping its head lightly into the mixture. She draws her lighter from her pocket and curses when she realizes it is ruined. "Sethos," she says, "don't suppose you've got a lighter in that bag?" "No, Professor," he replies, grunting as he pulls his backpack around and drops it onto the floor, opening it up. "But I have these. Here." He passes her a box of matches, and she thanks him, striking successfully on the first attempt and bringing fire to the oil torch. She does the same with the torch on the opposite side of the arch, and the bright ensuing yellow-gold glow allows us a greater view of our surroundings as she fixes them back into place. The hall ahead is flanked with thick, towering pillars, and directly ahead is an enormous statue, carved of stone, yet golden specks sparkle all over in the light of the flame. It depicts two men clad in royal Egyptian garb, engaged in a struggle. The man on top has the head of an animal. I'm not sure what it is, but it resembles an aardvark, or a jackal perhaps. The blade of a long carved knife held in his hand pushes deep in the chest of the man beneath. This man's stone skin has been marked with a fine, shining powder, one which turns it bluish-green in the torchlight. "The death of Osiris," Aziza murmurs as she steps closer, drawing her long wet hair from her eyes and tying it up into a ponytail. She cranes her neck to look up at the top of the statue. "These statues are of the gods, Osiris and Set." "The brothers," I mutter, looking them over. Dave taps on Set's knee with the back of his hand, then withdraws his phone from the plastic bag he'd stowed it in, pushing a headphone back into one of his ears. I think about the story of the pharaoh whose tomb in which we now trespass. Osiris and his brother Amkaro, the usurper. Why would Amkaro build such a tomb? I ask out loud. One so grand, one with such intricacies, for the brother that he murdered? "Perhaps he was afraid, Layla," comes a reply from the professor. "Afraid that Osiris would rise from the dead, and his vengeful spirit would seek revenge. The layered tomb could well reveal his fears, its intentions to keep him down. And these spells, this magic, the walls, the water, the stone, the Heka, is this the result of Amkaro's life work? His obsession with the occult?" "It would make sense," the professor replies, "motivated by fear, driven by paranoia." "What happened to him?" Ronnie asks. "To Amkaro, I mean." The professor sighs and holds out her hand. "I don't know, I'm afraid. There's a lot I don't know. Rocco would have the answers to these questions, I'm sure of it. But when it comes to his research, he always kept himself to himself, so to speak." In regards to Amkaro, my research suggests that the usurper came to a sudden and mysterious end, destroyed perhaps by his own obsession, and the pharaoh that followed had the task of rebuilding and revitalizing Amkaro's neglected empire. I look again at the statue, to think that these events took place thousands and thousands of years ago. It's staggering, fascinating, and terrifying to consider that over such a time as a species, maybe we haven't really changed that much at all. Guys, Ronnie says, gesturing to the statue's feet. Have you seen this? It's not obvious what he's referring to at first, as the dancing shadows from the flickering flame create curious illusions across the stonework. But once you see it, it's obvious. The statue is not connected in any way to the floor, nor it seems to anything else. It hovers in the air, fixed impossibly in place. I swallow and exchange looks of concern with the team, feeling a little dizzy as I do so. There's so much to process down here, and to have your most basic assumptions of the possible challenged so relentlessly, to see with your own eyes the existence of such mind-bending curiosities. Images of the professor turning Sethos to stone flash through my head, renewed, and my breathing becomes shallower. The air down here is hot and humid. It's like another world. As great as the statue is, team, we have a job here, unless you've forgotten. Dave mutters from the front, stepping to the side and walking around the edge of the colossal carving. Ronnie sticks the middle finger up to his back, and Aziza giggles. They go with Sethos around the right side of the statue, following Dave, and the professor and I go left. Why is Dave even on this mission exactly, Professor? I ask her quietly. He's an old friend, she replies with a smile. He's just a bit... Don't you think there's something off about him? He's been through a great deal. That doesn't give you the right to be a prick, though. The professor chuckles. Not quite, but I'm glad he's here, and I trust him implicitly, Layla. Really, I do. You'll have to take my word for it. I reply, unconvinced. Our footsteps on the tiles below echo around the hall, and it isn't long before we came upon an enormous long stone table. The others stand just on the opposite side of it. The entire length is covered in a curious thatched throw cloth, and after the professor has lighted the nearest wall torch, it sparkles like the statue, though this time with flecks of silver. Hieroglyphs have been perfectly stitched into this alien fabric, though only small parts are visible, as it is largely buried beneath great piles of ancient gold, long forgotten and shining relics amidst lumps of the precious metal, along with silver and copper, piled high all the way down the table and into the darkness toward the far end. Aziza reaches out to touch it, and Dave grabs her hand at once. Christ, girl, haven't you ever seen a fucking film? You don't disturb piles of gold and cursed tombs without an idea of what you're doing. Aziza laughs uncontrollably, but Dave does not return the smile. He releases her and she backs off, shuffling awkwardly a few steps away. Professor Winterfield, can you make sense of any of these hieroglyphs? Sethos asks, and the professor moves closer to the table, kneeling on the adjacent stone bench, angling her head for a better look. She mutters quietly to herself for a while, and the rest of us stand in anxious silence, listening to the beats of our hearts in the strange low rumble far beyond the walls. Yes, she says eventually, scratching her chin. I can make out a little. It mentions a great feast, a stop for weary guests. It suggests we make our presence known. A great feast? You mean like the Last Supper type deal? Ronnie asks. In a way, I suppose, but the concept of feast is an ancient one, Ronnie. It predates Christ by thousands and thousands of years. Its spiritual power is unique and long-standing. I could get a better sense of what the glyphs say if we could move around some of this metal, but I daren't disturb it. The professor pauses for another moment in thought. I think it's best if we try and find out a little... But she is cut off with a cry of distress from a little further down the hall. Aziza has stepped away from the group and has her torch beam shining down to the table's end. It has caught something in its light that was not previously obvious. Her hand shakes, but we can see what she has spotted easily enough. A man, a person, sat stooped at the head of the table. He is too far away from us to pick up any particular details, but he sits completely still, dark and waiting. We watch for a minute in thought, tense, quiet, watching to see if the figure is going to move. But he does not. Could be another statue, Ronnie whispers. But I'm not so sure. Tentatively, the professor walks down the length of the table. I follow, and the others on the opposite side keep pace. We draw closer and closer, and the figure becomes clearer and clearer. Oh hell, I mumble, coming to a stop a good distance away from it. It's an abomination. Tar black, encrusted skin is stretched over a hunched and broken skeleton, arms at its sides and palms down on the table before it. The skin gives away in places to a rock-like grey-brown, and one such area carries up its neck and across its lower jaw, crooked and distended, cracked to the side, teeth aged and yellowed. Half of its nose has crumbled away, and its eyes are closed tight shut in two dark slits. Lord in heaven, Ronnie mutters. That fucker's going to move at some point, ain't it? Chekhov's mother, the professor replies quietly, then spins on her heels and marches back down the length of the table. I follow. She does not stop until she reaches the complete opposite end, as far from the figure as we can get. She studies another section of the hieroglyphs across the thatch cloth, tries to gain some more insight. Make our presence known, she says again, reading from the glyphs. It says that guests should make their presence known to partake in the feast. She looks up and down the table, adorned in piles of gold. What feast? She asks rhetorically, and of course, none of us can answer. I need to move the gold to the side, she says. I need to look at the whole text. There's just not enough of it visible. Professor, Dave begins, warily, but she waves him off. I know, but there's nothing else in here, is there? There's the statue, the pillars, the table and the gold, and the fucker at the end of the table, as Ronnie so eloquently put it. She takes a deep breath. Here we go then, she whispers, as the ancient amber light dances with the shadows across her face, and she pushes the piles of wealth to the side. It falls and clatters noisily, spilling down over the table, and we try our best to keep any pieces from falling to the floor. But I don't think it matters, because a crack like the snapping of a great branch shivers down through the thick air from the opposite end from the long table. We turn to stare in terrified silence as the professor reads through the glyphs, her entire attention fixed determinedly on the tablecloth. There is another crack through the darkness, and in the flickering glow of the wall torch, the silhouette of the monster at the far end creaks into an unnatural stand, as if raised on a puppet master's invisible strings. The light of the torches wavers and shivers, blown by an unfelt breeze, and the creature rises to a full stand. Its legs are revealed, all four of them, long, black and spined, like an insect's, only massive. They tremble as the monster lurches from its position with a series of terrible cracks and begins to stumble slowly towards us down the side of the long stone table. My voice catches in my throat. Lord Almighty, Professor, Ronnie says warningly, his inflection indicating his position on the edge of panic. But the professor does not respond, nor does she look up. She continues reading, eyes darting from left to right as she mutters to herself with desperate drive. The creature draws closer, step by awkward step. The shadows it casts are long and many, twisted as they shiver across the stonework and the great pillars. I stand on the other side of the table. The professor knelt on the bench and hunched over the cloth beside me, but the others are huddled together, pressed up against the back of the floating statue of the death of Osiris. What the hell do we do? Aziza asks in a high-pitched, wavering whisper. Professor, says Dave, the urgency rising. But the professor again does not respond. Her focus lies with the glyphs. The dark figure approaches. "Right, cover your ears," Dave announces suddenly, raising the pistol up to his line of sight, taking quick aim and firing. The noise of the shot reverberates painfully around the chamber as a small burst of dark, crumbly sand-like flesh bursts through the creature's chest and out its back with the bullet. But, continuing instead to stagger towards us. Dave fires again, this time through its head. It twitches as the corner of its jaw disintegrates and a few of its shattered teeth are blown from its mouth. But it does not stop. The professor fumbles for something in one of her many pockets, drawing out eventually a little tin. "Try one of these, Dave," she calls out over the ringing in my ears and throws it to him, allowing only a quick glance out from the hieroglyphs. Dave catches the tin and cracks it open, revealing a number of small, shining silver bullets. Ronnie and Sathos exchange a look behind him, but the man asks no questions. He draws one out and opens the chamber of his gun, sliding the silver bullet inside. A hiss, like the release of high-pressured gas, escapes from the monster's throat. Only a few meters away now, and Dave takes aim and fires. A noise akin to a single beat of wind chime rings high and clear through the air, and the bullet tears through the monster's chest, creating a small hole adjacent to the first. But it does nothing, and as with the others, the figure barely registers it at all. "Oh well," the professor mutters, shooting another glance up at the monster. "Worth a try." "Professor," Sathos shouts out, "what are we going to do?" "Must I be the only one with any ideas in this accursed tomb?" she says. "Have you tried the torches, for heaven's sake?" The torches. There are 4 currently lighted and attached to the walls. One is held in its clasp near the pillars towards the head of the table, lit by Dave and beyond the path of the frightening figure. The other 3, however, are accessible. 2 remain by the entrance on opposite side of the arch. Sathos and Ronnie scramble for these. The 3rd is on my side of the table, a little ways down. I sprint for it, lifting it out of his hold in trembling hands, the flame blurring my vision temporarily as I grasp in front of me like a burning sword. The movement catches the creature's attention. Or perhaps it is the heat, as its dark eyes still appear tightly sealed. It pauses, and its head cracks around to face me, stood exactly opposite on the other side of the table. "Stay back!" I choke out, holding tight to the torch. The creature turns. Its head remains fixed on me, but it scuttles slowly around in a circle on those horrific insectoid legs so that its torso lines up with its face. Its jaw shivers, and the hissing grows louder. A blur of bright and wild orange shudders quickly through the air to the creature's right, and the thrown torch strikes it hard in the temple, the burning oil splashing out over its face. The monster shrieks in distress, a terrible and piercing sound that brings rains of dust down from the ceiling. It stumbles blindly backwards and into a pillar of flaming oil leaks and drops to the floor. It must have been Ronnie who threw the torch, as Sathos pushes forward, thrusting his own out and into the monster's chest. I have to join him. I push down my fears and scramble onto the stone bench, jumping over the piles of precious metal across the thatched cloth and land on the other side, screaming with adrenaline as I rush forwards and stab the torch into the thing's burning face again and again. It works for a while. We keep the creature from moving any closer to the professor. We force it back against the pillars as it struggles and shrieks. But our success does not last. The screeching warbles and distorts, dropping octave after octave into a thrum that seemed to vibrate my very bones, and it raises itself to its full height, head still aflame, reaching out with a swift and sudden movement and grabbing the head of Sathos' torch in its long black fingers. Their outlines shine in a silvery light, and with a burst of hot steam, the torch is extinguished. The flame goes out. Sathos releases his grip on the torch and stumbles back in horror, and the monster's head cracks around to face me. My reaction is immediate and foolish. I jump away in alarm, fumbling and dropping the torch and cursing myself silently for doing so in the same instant. It clatters to the floor, still burning, but no longer a threat to the creature. It steps right over it, towards me, Another bullet tears through the air with an accompanying bang and punches through the creature's ribs. But as with the others, it does nothing. And the professor speaks. "Set yourselves at the table at once," she commands in a voice like the wind. "Take your places on the bench and prepare for the feast." Dave turns to stare at her. "But Professor, no," she roars. "Do as I say." And as always, with the professor, we are compelled to obey. I turn from the creature, dark and burning, and clamber back over the stone table, piles of gold slipping and crashing from the cloth as I do so, scrambling around to sit myself on the bench beside the professor, her jaw clenched and brow furrowed, deep in concentration. I watch as the others take their seats on the opposite side of the bench, facing us. Sethos, and Dave and Ronnie and Aziza. They have their full trust in the professor, but the fear is plain across their faces. The monster, only a few feet behind them, raises a hand to the flames across his head, presses his long fingers down over the fire, and as before, they shine in the silver of a full moon, and with a burst of steam, the fire is vaporized. The room becomes a little darker, and it makes the move, becoming taller and taller behind the team as it approaches. Aziza is shaking violently. A thick bit of sweat rolls down the side of Ronnie's pale face. When the feast begins, the professor says in a low voice, "Do not stop. Do not stop eating until I say. Eat at a measured pace, and do not speak. Do not turn away from the table. We have a single chance." And she grabs a hold of an ancient relic upon the cloth. An ankh, glittering gold in the light of a few remaining fires. She raises it to her lips and brings down her teeth for a bite. The second she does so, the exact instant in which her teeth would hit the hard-cold metal of the object, it shimmers and changes into a leg of meat, poultry of some kind. Without even a flicker of surprise, the professor tears off a mouthful and begins to chew. We watch with a swirl of awe and dread as the metal all around us does likewise. It shifts. It fades in and out of focus like a golden fish beneath the surface of a river, and the food becomes clear. A plethora of fruits, some fresh, some dried, some that I recognize, but most I do not. Plates of rich, carved meat, on and off the bone, birds and seasoned vegetables, curious, strange-colored, hard-grained breads, dates, bowls of honey, figs and fine, white cheeses. It all shifts into view around us, and with heart beating fast, I tear my focus from the monster that approaches. I order myself not to stare at its shadow drifting across the table surface and redirect my gaze instead to the piles of food. I grab a handful of dates. I bring them to my mouth, take a deep breath, and start to chew. The others do the same. They each take a helping and begin to cautiously eat. And the monster stops. It stops where it stands, tensed, holding, waiting. For a while, there was only the sounds of our chewing and our shuddering breathing through our noses. I keep my eyes focused on the food before me. I can see the blur of the creature at the edge of my vision. But I do as the professor says, and keep my gaze fixed on the table. A soft melody starts to play. It rolls in waves all around the edge of the room, comprised of the sounds one can make when they blow over a glass bottle. And the creature turns. I hear it creak and hiss, turning to the left and heading back the way it came, back to its spot at the head of the table, slowly but steadily away. We keep eating. There is no shortage of food. It's good. It's warm. It's revitalizing. Difficult to enjoy under the circumstances, but I can appreciate its quality nonetheless. My eyes dart to the left, a momentary glance down to the head of the table. It's dark down there, but I catch a glimpse of the monster, settling back into place, taking its seat. And we keep on eating. That was the instruction the professor gave us. And hell, the professor's instructions are ones that demand to be followed. As the feast progresses, the melody in the air remains steady, a soft and haunting tune on the edge of hearing. But the food begins to change. The meats start to lose their warmth. The fruits, as I take bite after careful bite, are no longer fresh. After a while, I am able to notice this change visually too. With every bite, the fruit that remains on the table withers somewhat. They lose their color, they lose their shape. Mold starts to appear across the cheese, subtle at first in the flickering shadows, but growing into a more obvious blue and green-gray. But we keep on eating. The food starts to stink. The reek of it attacks our senses as we force down mouthful after mouthful. Quiet grunts and groans from around the team become audible. But a warning hand from the professor with a finger outstretched compels us into strange silence. Bite after bite, the feast goes on. My stomach lurches with every swallow. My skin sweats with discomfort as my mouthfuls of food becomes smaller and smaller. I have to start picking hairs and even small feathers from my mouth as I bite into the meats. The vegetables, the cheeses, as they bulge and melt with rot, they peel back to reveal bones, little ribs and slender, segmented spines. My stomach lurches again, harder this time, and some of the food rises back up into my throat. I grimace, eyes watering, and force it down. Dave is sat across from me. I can see the fingers in his right hand clenching into a fist, over and over and over. And then there is a loud gag. I cannot help but look from the table at the source of the noise, as Aziza shivers and vomits noisily over the food and the cloth. She gags again, slamming her hand to her mouth, and my attention is drawn to another noise, one at the head of the table. I swivel to look, to see the monster rise up from its seat, leaning forwards, scrambling down the length of the table on all four of his nightmarish legs, kicking plates and bowls noisily onto the floor as it approaches. I grab the professor's arm. "Professor, what do we keep eating?" she says coolly, but her voice wavers. The feast goes on. And it takes every ounce of will I possess to drag my gaze from the approaching abomination, to return it to the revolting food before me, and to continue to eat. But I do so. The creature approaches, the clattering draws nearer, and then, right by my head, it abruptly stops. The hissing is to my immediate left, by my face. If I were only to look up, to turn ever so slightly, I would see it. But I do not. I eat, and I continue to do so. We all do. Long after the food could ever reasonably be considered as such, forcing it down, bite after bite. The amount around us decreases. The plates and bowls start to empty. And we're in the final few plates, when one of us breaks. With a loud and tortured retching, they convulse, dark bile spilling from their lips, through their hands and spraying out over the table before us. They gag again and violently release, swearing in panic. Sethos, our driver. The creature does not even give him a chance to escape. With a sudden speed, it clambers down the stone table and bench behind him, using two of its legs to slam his hands down on the table, holding him in place. One of its hands presses down hard onto Sethos' shoulder, the other connects with the top of his head. "Nobody move," the professor hisses, particularly at Ronnie, sat to Sethos' left. "But, Professor," he replies under his breath, "the torch." "Don't you move, Ronnie. Don't you fucking move," she hisses back. "Eat." And we do so. We continue to force down the waste. We force it down as the creature's hand against Sethos' head starts to glow silver. "I'm sorry," Sethos screams. "I'm so sorry. Fuck." And he descends into a string of garbled Arabic, writhing and shuddering madly in place. The veins in his hands popped as his fingers rake across the stone. Steam bursts from the top of his head, temporarily shrouding the monster's hand in a mist-like cloud. And when it disperses, Sethos. Oh my god. Sethos. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry you chose to come down here with us in this place. When it disperses, the creature reveals, in its hand, Sethos' brain. Slimy and shivering, and our driver suddenly slumps forward, eyes lifeless, slamming down hard onto the stone with a terrible thud. Dark blood leaking from the hole in the top of his head, and indeed, it would seem his skull. The monster takes its prize and returns joltingly back to the head of the table. And we finish our feast. The last mouthful is mine. I force it down my throat with a strained swallow. And the statue to our right, the statue of the death of Osiris, begins to rise. A hole opens up in the ground below. And without a word, the professor stands from the bench and begins to quietly walk down the descending stairs the hole reveals. Dave carefully picks up Sethos' backpack, left propped up beside his corpse against the bench, and carries it with us as he follows. Ronnie stands up as well, and Aziza follows. Silent tears stream down her face. And in a state of shock, I follow too, mechanically like a robot, stomach twisting and bubbling. I follow the surviving team. I head to the hole beneath the statue and begin my descent. The stone stairs carry me around, and I catch one final glimpse of the monster at the head of the table before he vanishes from sight. A dark silhouette about to begin a feast of his own. And down I go. Down to the layer below. The second we arrive at the base of the stairs, Aziza is violently sick. The sound of the bile splattering against the dusty stone tiles is enough to make me gag myself, and I turn away, my stomach contracting painfully as I do so. "We did nothing," whispers Aziza, spitting and wiping her mouth as the professor lights the wall torch. I catch a glimpse of Dave, grim-faced, headphones in. Our eyes meet, and he looks away. She says it again, louder. "We did nothing. We just sat there and ignored him. Sethos is... he's dead. He's dead." "If you had gotten up to help, you would have been taken in turn," the professor replies. Aziza is shaking her head, angrily. "You don't know that, Professor. There were still burning torches. Maybe we could have... If you had gotten up to help," the professor says again, her voice rising. "You would have been taken." The walls down here shimmer and shift in a manner like they did on the second layer, rippling slowly like water, despite being hard and solid as rock to the touch. That same mysterious rumble from beyond growls steadily at the edge of our hearing. The professor sighs and rubs a hand over her forehead. "I'm sorry, Aziza. I'm sorry there wasn't more we could do. But Sethos is gone." And without another word, she lifts her head and strides off, deep into the hall with its high ceiling and multitude of yellow-gray pillars stretching off into the gloom. Dave follows. Ronnie comes by and squeezes Aziza on the shoulder before doing likewise. I walk together with the girl at the back of the procession. "It was my fault, Layla," she whispers to me, struggling to hold back sobs. "I'm the one who made the first noise. I threw the monster over. It's not fair. I survived, and he didn't. Why? How is that right?" I don't have an answer. I don't know what to say. So I just squeeze her close to me as we pass through the pillars, our footsteps echoing through the ancient darkness. We continued on, in more or less a straight line, for maybe around 20 minutes more in pensive silence. We passed through broken and fallen sections of wall, collapsed little arches and long-forgotten corridors of emberstone. There are many potential twistings and turnings, routes that lead away from the main path, so to speak. But we ignore them all and arrive eventually into a wide hall, marked by 4 enormous columns, larger than the rest, one in each corner. An obelisk stands in the center atop a series of low circular steps that rise up around its base. The top is pointed, with hieroglyphs carved all the way down. And behind it, against the far wall, massive and awe-inspiring, is an intricately carved scene, with even greater detail than the one that Satos had shown me in the first layer. There are 3 pictures depicted. The first shows a boy stood between 2 Egyptian gods. He wears the pharaoh's neme and holds in one hand the king's flail, the nekek. The second picture shows a sarcophagus stood in the place of the boy and adorned on either side by weeping women and a solemn priest. The third is similar to the first. A different boy, younger perhaps, stands between the gods. He likewise wears the neme, but instead holds the king's crook, known to the Egyptians as the heka, with a lowercase h. The boy in the first picture appears to be smiling. The boy in the third is not. Beside each picture is a series of glyphs, massive but few in number. The professor stares up at him. We all do. Dave casts the beam of his torch up to join the professors. Can you read them, Professor? I ask her. Yes, I'm surprised you don't recognize a couple yourself by now, Layla, she says quietly, pointing up towards the enormous glyph to the right of the first picture. That symbol there is Osiris's own, the name of the pharaoh. To its right is a pictogram often associated with the coronations of kings and queens, and to its right is a number, the number 10. Besides picture 2 is Osiris's name again, the symbol for death, and another number, 11. And picture 3 shows the name of Amkaro, the usurper, the symbol for coronation, and a number again, 9. What do they mean, Professor? Ronnie asks, and Dave mutters something under his breath. Use your fucking head, mate, he replies. They're ages, clearly. They're the ages of the pharaohs. I stare at the carvings in shock. Ages? But that would mean... I think on the legend of Osiris and Amkaro, on what the professor had told us, that Pharaoh Osiris was supposedly a wise and benevolent ruler of Egypt, a man who was jealously murdered for possession of the throne by his younger brother, Amkaro the usurper, a lunatic obsessed with the occult. Professor, that would mean that the brothers were just kids. They were just children? The professor does not answer. She stares up at the carvings and rubs a hand across her lower jaw. I never even considered the possibility. What kind of 9-year-old would kill his own brother? She muses quietly. There's so much going on here that I just don't understand. Why wouldn't Rocco tell me any of this? Why would he keep all his research so secretive? And why did he just disappear? Speaking of Rocco, Professor, it's Aziza. Her torch still works, and she has it pointed towards the corner of the hall by one of the arches that leads away into the dark. I think you might have been right on one thing. I think he was here, or someone was at least. Look. And sure enough, her light falls upon a brown satchel, the strap torn and dropped with an apparent lack of care onto the floor by the arch, the contents strewn about the dusty ground. I gasp, bringing a hand to my mouth. I recognize it. It is Rocco's bag. I have memories of him haphazardly swinging it around with him back at Oxford. And from her face, I can tell that the professor recognizes it too. We hasten over to it, as that same ethereal rumble, that subtle seismic growl, reverberates gently around the far walls. He was here, the professor mutters as we root through the contents of the bag. Rocco was here. There's a pair of knives in the back, a larger hunting knife and a smaller pocket knife. There's a shirt and a bandana, a scroll marked in hieratic, the common language of the ancient Egyptians, pages of scrawled and barely legible notes. And an amulet. A golden scarab, similar to the one we had used to enter the first obelisk, far above in the desert. I say similar, but truth be told, it could well be identical. I hold it in my hands. Professor, look at this. Is this the same kind of amulet that we used? The key? How did he manage to bring it through the stone with him? I envisage our own amulet, no doubt sat buried beneath the raging sands at the base of the lone obelisk, But she does not respond. She is staring at a photograph, an old one, torn at the sides. It's colorless, a picture of faded brown, and Aziza and I peer over her shoulders. It shows a group of explorers, old-timey looking folk, mustaches and monocles. Look at the man second from the right. The professor mutters, "Tell me what you see." I squint. The man appears to be smiling, but it's difficult to tell. In fact, the man kind of looks like Rocco. I whisper. "No, that's impossible, right? How old is this picture?" Aziza says, peering closer. "That doesn't look like Rocco. This guy has a big beard. Rocco doesn't have a beard." "Ah, yes," Ronnie snorts from a little ways away. "If there is only some way for a man to have a beard one day and not to have one the next. Some kind of ancient Egyptian magic to grow or vanish here, perhaps." Aziza sticks out her tongue at him, but I can't look away. It could be Rocco. Those eyes, the bridge of his nose. It could be him. It could be Rocco. But what would that mean exactly? How old is this picture? Ronnie and Dave have moved to one of the arches and peer cautiously around the corner into the darkness. I glance at them and am about to look down to the photograph. But curiously, Ronnie puts his hand on Dave's shoulder. I watch as he asks him something. He mutters close to Dave's ear in a low voice. There is a pause. Then Dave pulls back, angrily. I watch with surprise as he shoves Ronnie away, whispering something harshly under his breath. But I don't catch what he says. Ronnie looks shocked for a second, then puts out his hands and awkwardly laughs, tries to brush it off. But Dave does not laugh. He turns quickly to look back at us, and I drop my gaze to avoid meeting his eye, looking down instead at the items from Rocco's back. There's something up with Dave. I don't know what exactly, and I know the professor says she trusts him, but I'm not sure if I can say the same. The professor carefully pushes the photograph into one of her many pockets, rolling up her sleeves to reveal more of those fascinating, ancient, tribal tattoos, and she begins to read through a page of Rocco's notes. It ends halfway down the paper in a scrawl. She knows I am here. The professor reads aloud, her voice somber and low. Even after all this time, still, she remains, waiting, and I have woken her up. What have I done? She swallows. I cannot allow her to find me. If she catches a hold of me, then I am gone. I cannot be judged. If I am brought before Anubis, I will fail the test, and I will be hers. I cannot take the test. I cannot allow her to catch me. The professor's hands shake. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Amit is awake, and she is ever hungry. Amit is awake, and she is on the move. Silence. Who is Amit, Professor? Ronnie asks, uneasily. The devourer of the dead. The professor replies quietly. The soul eater. And again, we hear the rumble behind the walls. Only, now that we are listening more closely, it sounds less like the stirrings of the earth, and more like an actual growl. Deep and malevolent. And closer. Much, much closer. It sets the hair on my forearms and the back of my neck into a rise. I watch as Dave quickly draws his gun from his hip. Ronnie, examining Rocco's pocket knife as he was, tightens his finger around it. The larger of the knives I grab for myself, keeping it sheathed and attaching it to my belt with trembling fingers. A song starts to play through the hall, similar in tone to the one in the layer above. A series of long, low notes, forced from the air that passes quickly over the rim of a bottle or vase. The tune is a haunting one, and it makes me feel very cold. Very cold indeed. Dave pushes his headphones into his ears a little tighter. In a reptilian hiss, hostile and hungry, echoes from the far side of the hall. We all turn as one to look at the arch in the opposite wall, watching as a large shadowy shape emerges from behind it. The snout of an enormous gray-black crocodile. "Run!" the professor whispers, and we do so, scrambling to our feet and tearing away at once, desperately, feverishly, the terror that now burns within me compelling me forwards, commanding my legs to comply as we sprint chaotically through the dark and stony corridors. And Emmett follows. Round corner after round corner we run, blindly, but the music grows louder and Emmett keeps pace. Every time I dare risk a look over my shoulder, I see her at the end of the corridor, a dark and shadowed glimpse of a form, bounding after us, a monstrous and unforgiving chimera. The constant crocodilian hiss gives way to that rumbling growl. Dave, just ahead, stops in his tracks and swivels, raises the gun and takes quick aim, then fires. Once, twice. The sound of the gunshots burn in my eardrums, and the bullets strike their target, but the monster does not slow. Dave grimaces. He swears, muttering bitterly, turning and running along beside us. "Why the fuck did I even bother bringing this thing?" he spits as we crash round another corner. It's hard to tell, but it feels like we're being forced in a wide circle, with the 4-columned hall at the center. Ronnie is just at the head of the group. He turns to look behind. Then he stumbles, and as he does so, he slams hard into a stone pedestal, tripping and crashing to the ground and taking an ancient vase along with him in a shattering of dusty pottery. Clouds of sand billows up and around him as he falls, and it all happens so fast. We pass him by, then stagger to a stop as fast as we can, staring back. He cries out in pain, tries to stumble to his feet. The penknife has become embedded in his leg, and he grunts as he pulls it out with a splatter. "Ronnie!" Aziza screams. But there just isn't enough time. There isn't enough time to do a damn thing. He turns to look behind him, cowering in terror and protecting his face and throat with his arms as Emmett leaps upon him. I can see her properly now. She is an abominable creature, the size of a hippopotamus or larger, and her eyes flash orange-red atop a massive gray-black crocodile's head. The scales that lead down her neck are lost behind a thick mane of dark and tangled hair, and beneath it her torso appears as one of a big cat, the scales replaced entirely with thin, fine fur. She slams a heavy paw against Ronnie's head as he screams in panic. Dave raises the gun and fires again, the final bullet in the magazine, and it plunges deep into Emmett's chest. But she doesn't retreat, nor even react. Holding Ronnie in place, we are powerless to do anything but watch as the great beast lunges down and grabs one of Ronnie's legs in her powerful jaws. He bellows in pain and thrashes around, trying to fight her off, but she starts to drag the man quickly back down the corridor and away in the darkness. He disappears around the corner, still screaming, his cries for help echoing off and around the walls. "We have to go after him," Aziza shouts, turning to us all, one by one, and we nod in agreement. But the professor is looking elsewhere. We follow her gaze and nestle down one of the adjacent corridors, between two broken walls and beneath the carving of a watchful eye or a set of stone steps descending down to the layer below. She stares at him, as if in a trance, but I grab her shoulders. I look into her wizened and weather-beaten face. "Professor, we have to go after him. We have to go after Ronnie. We might still be able to save him." And her eyes refocus. Yes, of course. She stands up straight. Her energy, renewed, ripples through me. "What are we waiting for?" she asks, and we retrace our steps, boldly, hastily following the sounds of Ronnie's cries above the haunting melody in the air. Round corner after corner, we pursue the Soul Eater Emmett, having to pick up the pace to avoid being totally left behind. And we are led to another hall, one with 6 columns in place of 4. It is grayer in here, and we watch as quietly as we can from behind a broken wall, crouched, catching our breaths as Emmett drags Ronnie to its center, dropping him at the base of a giant statue. A jackal-headed man, the god Anubis. The statue's right hand is empty and open, but in his left he holds a colossal set of scales, with one scale empty, and on the other an enormous feather. It looks at first to be organic, but it glitters in the low light like a precious metal. Ronnie writhes in agony as he clutches his bleeding leg, and the Soul Eater bounds to the statue's side, settling on its large, powerful hind legs. Legs that don't seem to match its torso. She sits quietly, hissing hungrily, eyes fixed on the man in the center of the room. And the statue of Anubis stirs. "Professor," I hiss. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know," she replies. I don't know." We watch, mesmerized and awestruck, yet held firm in the grip of fear as the great statue looks down at the cowering figure of Ronnie before it. Dust falls like rain from its limbs and shoulders as it raises a hand, tilting its wrist, and what I can only describe as a kind of slow, pale lightning descends from the shadow above, crackling through the air and striking down into Ronnie's chest. I make to lurch forwards instinctively, but Dave grabs my forearm and holds me back. Ronnie is lifted into the air. A shadow forms beneath him as he struggles, his head twisting from side to side, convulsing with the energy. And then, the lightning is gone. He falls with a thud to the stone floor, groaning in pain. The lightning reforms as a ball in Anubis' raised hand. It cracks and flashes and takes the form of a large and beating heart, throbbing in waves of shimmering light. It reddens and hardens into solid flesh, still beating, and falls with a sickening thud down into Anubis' stone palm. "It's his judgment," the professor whispers. "They're going to weigh his heart on the scales." And sure enough, Anubis grips the heart and slowly places it onto the scales, on the empty side. He raises them up on high, and we can only watch as they tip one away towards the side of the heart, then back the other towards the side of the feather. "The feather of Ma'at," the professor whispers. "If the heart of the judged is lighter than the feather, it will be deemed that its owner lived a virtuous life, noble and true. If the heart is heavier, then it will be devoured." "Devoured?" Aziza whispers before she is shushed. "And how noble and true a life has our pal Ronnie lived then, do you reckon?" Dave mutters dryly, eyes fixed on the tipping scales. They rock from side to side, from the heart to the feather, from the feather back to the heart. Ronnie, on his damaged leg, tries to stagger back and away from the statue, but a warning growl from Emmett keeps him in place. Saliva drips from the monster's mouth and onto the stone below. "Please!" shouts Ronnie up to the statue. He must by now have at least an idea of what is happening. "I lived a good life. I paid my taxes. I gave blood for Christ's sake. I have so many more years left in which to do good. Just give me a chance. I'm not ready to go." The scales settle. The heart, it would seem, is heavier than the feather. And the statue of Anubis slowly turns from the scales to look back down at the man before him. Ronnie laughs awkwardly. "That's good, right?" he asks. The ground shakes. Anubis reaches out and grabs the heart in his giant, heavy stone hand and drops it. It falls through the air and lands in front of Ronnie, who staggers back in alarm as it splats against the ground. Emmett leaps from her perch. With a roar, she descends on the great heart and tears into it at once, snarling and writhing in fierce, ripping pieces off of it in splashes of thick, dark blood. Ronnie clutches his chest in agony and falls to the ground, convulsing, a victim of sudden sweat and spasming against the stone. I realize, to my shock and dismay, that no one is going to do anything. No one is going to act. No one, it seems, has a plan. And the conclusion is clear. It has to be you, Layla. You have to act. Don't wait for the cue from another. Take control. It has to be you, and it has to be now. "Let's go!" I shout to the others, panicked but desperate. "It has to be now!" And I leap from behind the broken wall and run down the length of the hall towards Ronnie. My own heart a desperate hammer as Amit feasts, and the great statue of Anubis lifts its gaze to watch my approach. I'm doing it. I'm going to save him. I'm going to save Ronnie. I think to myself. But I am too late. I am simply too late. Amit, her snout buried in the midst of the heart, pulls back and tears with it a thick dark piece of pipe-like flesh, a fountain of blood springing out and over her as she does so. And the ground beneath Ronnie gives away. The stone floor cracks and splits. And still writhing, he falls with the sand and debris. Down he falls, quickly disappearing out of view, and into the darkness below.
No!
I shout, staggering to a halt and peering down into the hole. But Ronnie is gone, and a hand on the back of my shirt drags me backwards as Amit devours a prize.
Fuck!
I shout, hands clenched.
Fuck!
But we have failed. So back we run, the muscles in our legs more than ready to throw in the towel. But we order them on, away from the grisly scene at the base of the statue of Anubis, and through the corridors to the stone steps. And the four of us descend down to the layer below.